Hi, folks. So in the last video, y'all learned about a reflection exercise you can use to reduce the stakes of a conflict, to sort of take some of your interests off the table and get those needs met in a different place. In this video, I want to introduce you to two different reflection exercises you can use, which aren't about sort of removing interest from the conflict, but rather are about making sense of what is going on in the conflict, and then sort of mapping your assumptions so that you can see them, and then giving you the ability to, one, ask better questions, and then clarify what you do know and what you don't know. So these reflection exercises are very similarly and somewhat confusingly named. They both come from the book Difficult Conversations, which is linked below. And you'll get a summary of them in the assigned reading, but they are called The Three Conversations and The Third Story. So the Three Conversations exercise assumes that when there's a conflict, all of us are having sort of three conversations with ourselves, or should have three conversations with ourselves, which are, what do I think is happening? What am I feeling? And how does this conflict impact my identity? So I'll give you an example from a relatively low stakes conflict, but I suspect some of you all have been there. When I was first in graduate school, I was like 23 and living in a real house for the first time with roommates that I didn't know very well. I felt like I was doing the vast majority of the cleaning. I felt like I was always the one who wiped down the counters, and that other people would leave stuff on the dining room table, and that like nobody would get around to doing the dishes. And so I was doing more than my fair share of the work. That was my story of what was happening, what was going on. And how I felt about this was angry, because I thought my roommates were showing me disrespect and discourtesy, and I was feeling kind of uncomfortable in the house because it felt like kind of crummy and disorganized and stressful. And this impacted my identity because I felt like I was letting myself be taken advantage of. So I felt sort of shame for not being the kind of person that other people take seriously, that I'm like sort of a pushover, which is a lot to put on, which is a lot. That's a lot going into how quickly the dishes get done, you know? But I was feeling all that. Now, if I that and to walk you all through those three questions, what happened? How did I feel? And how does this impact my identity? It's clarifying because you can start to see how much weight a particular conversation, a particular conflict is bearing for you. But then the next step in the three conversations is to try and write out the three conversations for another party. So in this case, it would be my roommates. What did they think was happening? Well, they maybe thought we were all doing about the same amount of work. And it just always seems like you're doing more work because you don't see the work that all roommates feel like they're carrying more of the load, because the because we don't see what the other people are doing when we're not there. And they felt kind of taken aback and criticized, and like, man, I can't even like relax in my own home. And it impacted their identity because they thought of themselves as like, kind of a reliable person. And this person, and like their nitpicky roommate was calling into threat their identity as a reliable person. Okay, that's my best take on what my roommates thought at that time. Here's where you pause and ask yourself, how certain am I that that is what the other person thinks? And you might be very certain because they may have told you explicitly, although they may not have told you the full story. But it just helps you to pause and say, like, I'm assuming that they're doing this because they don't take me seriously. But how much do I really know about why they're doing what they're doing. And might there be other things going on? It helps you ask better questions. So those are the 3 conversations. And my experience has been every single time I do this, and this is just anecdotal, I haven't seen any empirical studies of this, but every time I pause and write down exactly how I feel, I can go, oh, wow, that was a lot. I was carrying a lot there. And it brings some relief. I can't exactly tell you why, but I can tell you that it does. And I don't know that it does that for everyone, but it certainly does that for me. And then when I write down what I believe they're feeling, it becomes clearer to me that my beliefs, which are often implicit and are often strongly felt and are driving my emotions and therefore in some way driving my behavior, that they are in fact assumptions. And I might have good reasons for having hypothesized that that is how the other person feels, but I might not. I might have some real gaps. Also, what this can do, this can help me go back to that other exercise and say, are there interests at stake here that might really be under threat that I could take care of in some other relationship besides this one? Like in the example I just gave where I felt like I was kind of a pushover. And this was this example of there's a self-esteem problem there, right? Like I didn't yet believe that I deserved to be taken seriously. And so I was ready to read small slights as that as confirmation of that belief. Well, there's probably other things I could do to one is just getting older. It's amazing. You just get older. You accomplish some things and you don't feel like the 23-year-old who has to prove herself all the time, right? But there may be ways of solving those problems outside of the conflict relationship. But you certainly start to see that I am working on a set of operating assumptions, which we always have to do. But those assumptions might not be right. Like it might be that my roommates just didn't like they're really grateful for the way I keep the house clean. Or they might not just have noticed at all. Or they might assume that it's okay for the house to be dirty. And so they didn't expect me to clean it any more than they expected that they should have to clean it. They're just comfortable with a different level of cleanliness. It wasn't about showing respect or disrespect or discourtesy to me. They're just comfortable in a different environment. All of those things are possible. Or they could be slammed at work that week and they're overwhelmed with law school and they know that the apartment is gross and they know that somebody else is picking up the slack when it's not gross and they feel bad about that, but they're so swamped that they can't really do a whole lot better. It's still a problem, but it's not the same problem that my 3 conversations described it as. Okay, so those are the 3 conversations, and there's just something about that that can like turn down the knob on the angst of the conflict. The 3rd story conversation is about looking at a conflict in the way that a neutral third party would, without value judgments, and in as concrete a manner as possible. So in that situation, a neutral, try to imagine somebody kind, but honest and respectful. How a kind, honest, and respectful third party describes this situation in concrete terms. And they might say something like, Liz and her roommates have different expectations about the rhythms of house cleaning. They have different expectations about how often it should be cleaned and how the labor should be divided and what kinds of tasks can wait a day or 2 and what tasks need to be done immediately. That's a relatively value-free way of naming like what is the thing that y'all are fighting about without saying you're bad and you're good and you're kind of in the middle. Like there aren't a lot of value judgments. It's just a description of the events. So those 2, and that can be very helpful because if you can articulate to yourself what is the 3rd story, so what is the problem that needs to be solved, but not without assigning blame to anybody, then it makes it much easier to raise concerns about that thing when you can say, hey, here's a problem I would like to invite you to solve with me. You don't have to start by blaming somebody for screwing something up. Because it's really different for one roommate to say to another, hey, I think we have different expectations about how quickly the dishes get done. That's really different than saying, can we talk about that? That's really different than saying, look, I've been doing your dishes for the last week and it's really annoying me. Both are understandable. They probably respond to the same situation, but they're likely to elicit different responses. All right, good luck writing your 3 conversations and your 3rd story.